Approximately 2,600 years before the Battle of Ruusan, the old Sith Empire under Emperor Vitiate attacked Republic space, instigating the Great Galactic War. During the conflict, the Sith Master Lord Califo took the former slave Teneb Kel as his apprentice. While Kel distinguished himself in his master's service, Califo was ultimately unable to complete his training, taken into custody by the Sith Dark Council after a failed power grab. As the apprentice of a fallen master, Teneb Kel was viewed as a disgrace, and was dispatched to hunt down the traitor Exal Kresh, the former apprentice of the Emperor himself, an apparent suicide mission. Handily defeated by Kresh above Lenico, Kel achieved a narrow victory over her in a rematch in the Tombs of Korriban. Over the course of his mission, he discovered Vitiate's plan to create the Children of the Emperor, slaves to his will, and used this information to leverage the Dark Council into declaring him a true Sith Lord, taking the name of Darth Thanaton. Almost a millennia after the Battle of Ruusan, during the waning years of the Old Republic, Jedi Master Kit Fisto would take the young Mon Calamari Nahdar Vebb as his apprentice. However, the start of the Clone Wars in 22 BBY would prevent Fisto from personally supervising the last stages of Vebb's training in the Jedi arts, and Vebb ascended to knighthood without his master. Early on in the war, Vebb and a squad of clone troopers tracked a stolen Republic ship containing the Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray to the Vasek system, where he rendezvoused with Master Fisto. Together, they explored the compound where Gunray was apparently hiding, only to discover that they had walked into an elaborate trap, and were being pitted against the Jedi hunter, General Grievous. In the ensuing melee, Vebb recklessly attacked Grievous alone and was viciously gunned down by the cyborg. As I think I made quite clear with the blunt instruments, I am perfectly willing to use characters from Star Wars The Clone Wars in my Versus series, despite my reservations about that show. In fact, I will concede that when taken purely on their own merits, many of TCW's storylines are actually fairly decent. Qualitatively speaking, my main complaint about the series is that the writers were clearly making things up as they went along rather than planning things out, the result of this being many missed story opportunities, things that could have been truly epic had the writers dedicated themselves to story logistics and world building instead of rule of cool. Nadar Vebb is one of these missed opportunities. To explain my viewpoint, I will outline what I would have done with the character had I been one of TCW's showrunners. Firstly, while the story would play out largely as it did in the actual episode, Vebb would have survived Lair of Grievous and continued to serve as a Republic general, the idea being that while Fisto is disturbed by the hateful sentiment expressed by Vebb, he would have had no real reason to pull him from active duty. Fast forward to Season 4, an increasingly violent and jaded Nadar Vebb would be replacing Pong Krell in the Carnage of Krell arc. Again, the story would play out much as it did in the original, but the difference is that Vebb would again survive. The twist ending here would be changed over from him defecting to the Separatists to him operating as Palpatine's plant within the Jedi Order, having pledged his loyalty to the future Emperor after foreseeing the rise of the New Order. And fast forward to Rebels. Nadar Vebb is the Inquisitor. A long and involved character arc told over multiple episodes and crossing over between two different television series depicting the moral degradation of this one Jedi, a degradation brought on by a loss of faith and a growing lust for vengeance, leading him to betray everything he stood for and declare his loyalty to a force of tyranny and oppression that he should have fought to the last breath to oppose. You know, that really compelling character arc that is one of the cornerstones of the Star Wars mythos? Think about that for a second. And now that all of that is out of the way, allow me to present Teneb Kell versus Nadar Vebb. While Teneb Kell was well respected by certain circles within the Sith Imperial military for his accomplishments on the battlefield, and was clearly a competent fighter, he was not a dedicated lightsaber duelist. As a Sith Inquisitor, his emphasis was instead on developing as a Force wielder, making him a likely Nyman specialist. The sixth classical form of lightsaber combat, Nyman was a jack-of-all-trades fighting technique based around the ideals of moderation and balance. Easy to learn, though difficult to master, it was developed specifically to accommodate Force wielders with more academic inclinations, allowing them to maintain a basic level of competence in all areas of combat without the need for dedicated martial arts training, so they could focus primarily on developing their alternative skills and powers. As such, the art was perfectly suited for Kell's needs as an Inquisitor, and many of his demonstrated skills were very much in keeping with the attributes of Nyman. Teneb Kell's personal technique was practically dictated by his chosen weapon, a red-bladed archaic saber staff. As a one-handed dexterity weapon, the lightsaber lent a number of superficial similarities to Exar Kun's approach to Kell's style, notably the use of one blade to deflect attacks before spinning the hilt to counter with the other. However, where Kun incorporated a dual-phase mechanism into his lightsaber to allow for the use of vicious Trikata tactics, Kell's weapon lacked such alternative functions, and as a result his style was much more straightforward. What you see is what you get. Aside from the occasional flourish, his technique was clean and direct with few elaborate movements. In keeping with his apparent use of Nyman, he reinforced his lightsaber attacks with a skillful integration of Force-based attacks, particularly Force Lightning, and has also been observed employing physical combat techniques. His Force abilities especially were one of his primary tools, allowing him to use his environment as a weapon and attack from unexpected vectors. Teneb Kell was an ambush predator who relied on shock and deception, preferring to undermine his enemies and prevent them from bringing their full power to bear rather than confront them directly. On the battlefield, he was an assassin who avoided the fighting, instead keeping a low profile while tracking down and taking out enemy commanders or any other targets of opportunity. In single combat, he focused on bypassing his opponent's defenses and blindsiding them with his Force abilities. These tactics of treachery were reinforced by his aptitude for strategic analyses and assessment, learning the measure of his opponent and tailoring his own responses to better combat what they were bringing to the table. I see this as being best demonstrated by his engagements with Exal Kresh. In their first duel on board Lenico Colony Blue, she successfully ambushed him, using his own tactics against him and employing every trick in the book to keep him off balance while she tore him apart, and in the process providing a first-class demonstration of her full range of skills and powers, knowledge which allowed him to contend with her much more effectively during their rematch on Korriban. In holding his own against such a powerful Force adept, Kell demonstrated his flexibility and adaptability, proving that he was a force to be reckoned with despite his youth and inexperience. However, he was ultimately held back by his lack of variation as a swordsman, capable of combating anything thrown at him, but not bringing anything new to the table himself. Ultimately, Teneb Kell's most notable victories were achieved not through skill with the blade, but through his power in the Force. The former trainee of the acclaimed Jedi Swordmaster Kit Fisto, Nadar Vebb was a talented duelist, and acquitted himself well in combat with the infamous Jedi Hunter General Grievous and his IG-100 Magna Guards. Granted, this is TCW's version of Grievous, which is ridiculously underpowered compared to his depictions elsewhere, and based on that, I'm actually more inclined to favor Vebb based on his performance against the Magna Guards, as they, unlike Grievous, are at least consistently presented as an actual threat. Vebb's chosen fighting discipline has not been established in any source, though I believe that he is more than likely a specialist in Shicho lightsaber combat, as many of Vebb's demonstrated skills match with the attributes of the form, and Vebb's teacher, Kit Fisto, is the current reigning master of Shicho. Shicho was the first classical form of lightsaber combat, developed to serve as the tutorial style of the Jedi Order. To this end, it emphasized simplicity in its techniques and disciplines, focuses which made it a good fallback option when more elaborate fighting styles were inappropriate. Shicho's core discipline of releasing oneself into the Force, a good technique for Jedi trainees working on developing their combat skills, but extremely dangerous when elevated to the nth degree, making a dedicated study of Form 1 just as much of a risk to a Jedi's psychological balance as the study of Juya or Vapad. Where Kit Fisto was able to meet these demands, his application being defined by control and restraint, Nadar Vebb was clearly starting to crack under the pressure. Vebb wielded a comparatively nondescript lightsaber with a blue blade, the simplicity of his weapon reflecting the simplicity of his style. Dynamic and agile, he combined deft acrobatics with direct blade work, performing powerful sweeping attacks with a precision and refinement that belied his ferocity. While perfectly capable of mounting a stonewall defensive posture, Vebb's inclination was instead to rely on evasion, which left him primed to unleash quite devastating counterattacks. He reinforced his heavy-handed fighting style with a skillful integration of telekinetic strikes. Vebb's conduct in battle was defined by his ruthlessness and aggression. He relied on acrobatic evasions to simultaneously bypass his opponent's attack and work his way inside their guard, countering immediately. His focus was on maintaining his forward momentum even when under fire, changing his attack vector and taking the path of least resistance, exploiting the openings that result from an overzealous offensive, something that he achieved with both precise lightsaber strikes and with deft telekinetic attacks. For all intents and purposes, Nadar Vebb was Lucien Dray light, with all of the positive and negative connotations that entails. He was a devastating offensive powerhouse capable of plowing through multiple enemies in a heartbeat, but he was reckless, unrestrained, and ironically quite vulnerable against the very tactics that he himself relied upon. Just as he blindsided enemies with non-linear attack patterns, he himself was blindsided by a treacherous sneak attack. There is no question that Teneb Kell's more calculating and strategic approach provides him with a considerable advantage, especially given Nadar Vebb's proven vulnerability against the sort of ambush tactics that Kell typically relies on. However, Kell is held back by his lackluster fencing skills. his lack of variation forcing him to lean hard on his force abilities to make up the difference. In Kell's defense, his comparatively simple style affords him a high degree of flexibility, allowing him to contend with anything thrown at him, especially here, given how simple and straightforward Vebb's own style is. But at the end of the day, Teneb Kell's lightsaber skills are nothing more than a delaying tactic, and he simply can't compete with Vebb's ferocity. For all his cunning, Kell's tactical ingenuity does not carry over to his use of the lightsaber, whereas Vebb's style is practically the manifestation of his approach to combat, and a pure lightsaber duel between them would end with Kell being overwhelmed. Nadar Vebb gets the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist. Teneb Kell was a human male in his early 20s, distinguished by a facial tattoo over his right eye. He occasionally displayed the yellow eyes indicative of deep immersion in the dark side of the Force, though thanks to his beginner status, the degenerative effects brought on by the negative energy field had not yet started to set in. Well within his physical prime, he was quite fit despite his emphasis on academics over combat training. Kell's physical capabilities were well within the norm, though highly impressive nonetheless, and he was distinguished by his high tolerance for pain and injury. He has been subjected to severe blunt force trauma, has shrugged off electrical burns caused by force lightning, survived exposure to hard vacuum, and fought off a Tarantatek on Lenico while severely injured. He does have his limits and can be beaten into submission, but it takes a lot to get him to that point, and even then he's been able to bounce back very quickly. Ultimately, Teneb Kell was neither the strongest nor the fastest, but he was quite well rounded and could take a serious beating. A Mon Calamari male, Nadar Vebb was likely in his early 20s, though aside from his force sensitivity, there was little to distinguish him from typical members of his species. Wide-set eyes capable of independent movement provided him with a greater field of vision, a clear asset for such a dedicated duelist. An immense lung capacity enabled him to hold his breath for hours at a time, and webbed hands and feet made him a natural swimmer. But on the other hand, as a member of an aquatic species, he was extremely sensitive to arid conditions. Allowing for the enhancement of one's physical performance through the Force, Vebb's capabilities were very well developed, and his feats of agility, flexibility, and strength were highly impressive. Considering that the only hits we saw him take were the blaster shots that killed him, Vebb's tolerance for pain and injury is difficult to gauge, though I somehow doubt that he was some glass cannon who couldn't take a hit. End of the day, Nadar Vebb was a strong and fast-paced fighter who could dish out a massive amount of punishment in a heartbeat. Teneb Kell's impressive endurance is a significant asset in his corner, but his otherwise middling physical attributes leave him at a disadvantage against an opponent like Nadar Vebb, who clearly outclasses him in terms of strength and agility. Vebb's superiority is further reinforced by his physiological advantage, namely his larger field of vision. In a contest of pure physical prowess, Kell could only contend with this adversary, where Vebb could be expected to dominate in the long run. Nadar Vebb gets the edge in terms of physical ability. As a mere Sith apprentice, Teneb Kell's force abilities were relatively underdeveloped, though his inherent power was still considerable, and even the Dark Council acknowledged his potential. and when taken on his own merits, Kell was actually quite adept, employing those powers he did have with precision and ingenuity, and as a Sith Inquisitor dedicated to academic pursuits, devouring books like scraps of bread in the words of his master, he did possess a certain degree of arcane knowledge. However, as a Sith, his skill set was largely optimized for combat, and while he wasn't exceptionally powerful, he was extremely devious, expertly integrating all of his offensive powers into his lightsaber sequences, attacking his opponents on multiple levels. As a telekinetic, he was capable of lifting and moving objects weighing hundreds of pounds, and it was this application that he relied on most heavily in combat, pummeling his enemies with loose objects or outright manhandling them. He has also been observed deflecting thrown objects, improving his defensive viability. Though easily deflected, his lightning was powerful enough to destroy heavy machinery and even kill a Tyranitar on Lenico. He has used force-based physical augmentation to boost his agility and reflexes to superhuman levels, with enhanced acrobatics being one of his personal staples. Despite his heavy combative focus, Kell also boasted a number of alternative utility powers. He was capable of the basic mind trick, and it is implied that he is also capable of entering into healing trances, awakening refreshed after his vision quest on Lenico despite being severely injured when he entered into that state. He was instructed in the art of prophecy by his master Lord Califo, with some of the specific techniques he used including the mantras of the Maraugers and the 9 breath forms devised by his master. Lord Califo taught that vision becomes clearest when death draws near, and accordingly, Teneb Kel was at his most powerful and most dangerous when under pressure, and many of his most effective uses of the Force were heat-of-the-moment desperation tactics. As a combative Force wielder, Kell favored turning his adversary's strengths against them and using the environment to attack from unexpected vectors. As a neophyte, he lacked the strength to overpower his enemies, so he preferred to blindside and ambush them. As such, he rarely employed direct telekinetic strikes such as Force Push or Force Grip, as he was incapable of penetrating the telekinetic barriers of many of his adversaries, and he himself was ragdolled with clear ease by Exal Kresh on Korriban. He may have been a capable user of Force Lightning, but he lacked the ability to defend against it. Accordingly, his greatest asset was shock and surprise, and when deprived of this advantage, he was forced to improvise. In conclusion, Teneb Kel was skillful and wielded a surprising level of magnitude, but his powers lacked substance. Fortunately, his cunning went a long way towards making up for this. Though Exal Kresh used this label in a purely derogatory sense, it was still quite accurate. Teneb Kel was a hound, an effective ambush predator, and like any wild animal, most dangerous when cornered. As a Force wielder, Nadar Vebb was a natural talent, especially noted for his gift with the healing arts. Due to this, he more than likely prospered under the instruction of Kit Fisto, a noted Jedi consular. However, Vebb's experiences in the war changed him, and his powers began to display a darker side. On a grand scale, Vebb was capable of using telekinesis to influence weather conditions, notably clearing the mist in front of Grievous's castle on Vassek, and he has been observed using both pushes and throws in combat. As he functioned primarily as a lightsaber duelist, force-based physical augmentation was his bread and butter, enhancing his strength, agility, and reflexes to a superhuman level. Notably, he was capable of matching the mechanical strength of the cyborg General Grievous in lightsaber combat. With Force Heal, his emphasis was on battlefield utility, accelerating the healing process and allowing the soldiers under his command to keep fighting even after grievous injury. He was noted as a master of this art, ironic considering how aggressive his combative applications of the Force were. Vebb became increasingly preoccupied with strength, and in his quest for the power to crush his enemies, he clearly began to draw on his passion and rage. Though his emphasis on lightsaber combat meant that he used the Force somewhat sparingly, when he did employ his powers, he did so bluntly and without restraint. Though he was not unintelligent in his applications, bypassing the defenses of his opponents with thrown objects. Like a proper Shicho specialist, he released himself into the Force, wielding its power wildly and powerfully, yet clearly viewed it as an instrument through which to exert his own will. I see this mentality as ironically being the result of his mastery of Force Heal. This is pure speculation on my part, but I have come to believe that Vebb has moved beyond simply helping others recuperate from injury and has begun to actively toy with the fabric of life itself. He was seeking the power to overcome death, and the soldiers under his command were sustained by his will. So imagine his rage when someone that he was responsible for died and there was nothing he could do about it. Nadar Vebb had no reverence for the Force and wielded its power casually, concerned only with asserting his will and crushing his enemies. This contest is ultimately decided not by lightsaber combat but by Force abilities, and in this area Teneb Kel enjoys a significant advantage. Jedi training prioritizes utility over combat, making Jedi much more well-rounded Force wielders overall, but leaving them at a disadvantage when pitted against Sith adepts of similar power, due to the much heavier emphasis Sith training places on combat. And this factor holds true here. While Nadar Vebb's skill in the healing arts improves his overall survivability, it doesn't provide him with any sort of edge over Kel, and he has no answer for Kel's use of Force Lightning. The power where there is the least disparity between the two is telekinesis, as both have demonstrated similar levels of magnitude and employ similar tricks. But Kel's advantage still shines through thanks to his broader skill set. Where Vebb is limited to pushes and throws, Kel adds in grips and deflections, the latter especially improving his defensive viability. However, while Nadar's emphasis on lightsaber combat did hold him back as a combative Force wielder, this is not a crippling weakness in and of itself, as we have many examples of powerful Force wielders being overcome by superior swordsmen. What really makes this Kel's game are their tactics and battlefield conduct. Both are highly aggressive tactical opportunists, but where Kel is very proactive, using his powers to influence his environment and create openings, constantly looking for ways to blindside his adversaries, Vebb is extremely reactive, simply exploiting opportunities as they come up, as opposed to actively trying to control the fight. While he will use his Force abilities if necessary, Vebb is focused mainly on achieving this in a lightsaber duel, which is a problem as Kel generally uses his lightsaber only for close quarters defense, and isn't producing those openings that Vebb is looking for. Given time, Nadar would inevitably plow through Teneb's defenses, but Kel wouldn't exactly be standing there doing nothing. Each is attacking the other where he is weakest, but the disparity between them as Force wielders is greater than the disparity between them as swordsmen. So where Vebb would need time to pound Kel into submission, Kel is able to deliver immediate and devastating counters that Vebb simply can't deal with. And Vebb is further held back by his inexperience, where Kel has learned the hard way to be on the lookout for any deceptions or sneak attacks on the opponent's part. Vebb hasn't. For all intents and purposes, Nadar Vebb is a sports fencer who thinks he is being novel by cheating, while Teneb Kell is the murderous assassin willing to do anything to win and is expecting the same from his opponent, and the final result is no contest. I declare Teneb Kell the victor.